It's around 2:15 in the morning, April 15th, 1912, and the RMS Titanic does not have long to live. For the past 2 hours, the ship has fought a losing battle against buoyancy and gravity, and now she is beginning to give up her last ounce of strength in the fight to stay afloat. Compartments are flooded, hallways and ornate public rooms are slowly going under. It's now just a matter of time, and the clock has already started. The ship doesn't have much time left. What's about to play out is some of the most awful, harrowing drama to ever happen at sea. This 45,000-ton ocean liner is about to be violently swallowed by the ocean, and the hundreds of people clinging desperately to her for survival are about to endure a series of horrible events. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today I've partnered with our good friends at Titanic Honor and Glory to use their incredible animations to bring to you some of the true, horrifying stories from Titanic's final 5 minutes. In the immediate aftermath of Titanic's collision with the iceberg, it became clear that something was horribly wrong, but the realization wasn't quick. For the ship's crew and designers, it took some time to gauge what was actually happening, and slowly the clues began to come in. At the forepeak, the very front of the ship, a hissing noise was heard that indicated that air was being pushed out of a vent from somewhere deep within the ship, and only water could be the thing pushing the air out. Elsewhere, covers over cargo hatches began to bulge outwards because of that same effect. And after some 45 minutes, the situation had become clear. Titanic was sinking. She was going down slowly, but she would definitely sink. For 2 hours or so, the ship had settled slowly in the water, but it was so gradual that it tricked people into a false sense of security. Everybody thought the ship couldn't sink. That myth had spread through word of mouth and was even being pushed by the ship's officers and builders on board. But it was only after some of the early lifeboats were lowered and sent away with reluctant, maybe even cynical occupants that they noticed the ship was sitting lower by the head in the water, and it only got worse. For the next hour or so, the ship's boats were filled and lowered, and things had started off calmly. But by the end, when the feeling of the ship sinking underfoot could no longer be ignored, human drama began to play out, and panic settled in. By 2:10 in the morning, the ship's bow was underwater, and the last of her boats were being got ready, and the end seemed near. But then, things took an unexpected turn for the worst. Titanic took a plunge downward. We'll pick the story up at 2:10 a.m. Titanic's bridge front is dangerously close to the lapping waves. In the Marconi wireless room on the boat deck, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, the two young wireless operators, are desperately firing off distress calls in an attempt to organise a rescue. They know that Carpathia, the nearest ship, is still hours away, and although they can't see outside from their office, they can tell the end must be near, because they can hear people rushing about outside on deck, and, perhaps more ominously, the ship's power is beginning to dwindle, and with it, so too is their wireless system's range. While Phillips taps out his urgent calls for help, Bride fiddles with the machinery to try to get the maximum power possible. Outside, on deck, things are getting desperate. The Titanic had a pronounced shear where either end of the ship was designed to rise slightly upward to aid against pitching up and down in the ocean. But this shear had masked the forward angle downward that Titanic had assumed all night. By now, that angle had reached about 8 or 9 degrees, and it was greater than the shear, and passengers could at last tell that their ship was going down by the head. The ones that began to crowd the deck outside could see something else that was ominous. The lifeboats were all gone. In the minutes prior, groups of panicked people had tried to force their way aboard the last to be lowered, but pistols had been fired by the crew to scare them away, and now, with the big wooden lifeboats all gone and rowing away from the ship, the crew were battling to release and fill the last remaining collapsible boats. These were an absolute last resort, a kind of flat-bottomed barge with canvas sides which could be raised to keep the water out. They were smaller than the main lifeboats, with an occupancy count of just 47, with around 1,500 people still left on board. There were now just spots left for 94 of them. But there was a problem. the boats are kept high up on the roof of the officers' quarters above the boat deck, where the davits, which are the lifeboat cranes, were located to actually launch the boats over the ship's side. First Officer William Murdoch has been in charge of lowering and filling lifeboats on Titanic's starboard or right-hand side, while Second Officer Charles Lightoller has commanded the port side operations. Now, both lead teams of men to manhandle those collapsible boats from off of the roof down onto the boat deck, where they can be filled and lowered away. There was a whole system for this. The collapsibles were meant to be attached with guy wires to the first funnel's support cables or stays, and the tackle could be used to then gradually lower the heavy boats down with simple pulleys. But there was a simple unforeseen problem with this neat arrangement. The tackle was stored forward in the bow section, which by now was already over 100 feet below the ocean's surface. The men struggled with the boats and maneuvered them by hand while crowds of people jostled and watched on helplessly. At the stern, dozens of people have gathered, instinctually attempting to get as far away from the water as possible, but it's a hopeless affair because sooner or later the stern will be consumed as well. They are gathered in groups, with one passenger describing them as looking like clumps of bees. Many of them are third-class passengers. They had gathered earlier in the aft well deck near the general and smoking rooms to await instruction that simply never came. Now, with no boats left and the ship's bow slipping below, they gather at the stern and wait for the end. In the third-class general room, a woman nervously plays piano for her young daughter on her lap, and above her head, on the poop deck, two priests, Father Thomas Biles and Father Joseph Perushitz, are giving absolution, hearing confession and reciting the rosary to over 100 passengers who crowd around them. The stern is beginning to lift higher out of the air, and the 3 bronze screw propellers have emerged ominously from the ocean. Fighting his way through the crowd is 23-year-old storekeeper Frank Prentice. He has stood on the poop deck chatting idly with his friends Cyril Ricks and Michael Kieran, but now it's becoming too crowded. The trio begin to consider climbing over the port side railing and jumping. Down in the bowels of the ship, icy water roars through openings, not from below, but from above. Titanic has sunk slowly so far, with water coming in only through the iceberg-damaged hull, but now, with her bow underwater, tons and tons of ocean water can surge through the vents, cargo hatches, and open spaces up on deck. It means that the more Titanic goes under, the faster she sinks, and those not already up on deck are caught by the rapidly rising water level and drowned. At the base of the forward funnel, the crew, under Officers Murdoch and Lightoller, are still struggling with the collapsible boats when a huge crowd of third-class passengers surge out of a door from the first-class grand staircase at its entrance. It's not known where these dozens of people had come from or where they got held up down below, but for the crew planning to lower the last lifeboats, it was a sudden shock. They thought most of the women and children had got away safely, but now dozens more had appeared from nowhere, panicked and desperately seeking escape. In the wireless office, Titanic's radio men are still hard at work when a stoker creeps in to try to steal Philip's lifebelt from him while he works at the wireless key. Harold Bride strikes him down and knocks him out cold, so Phillips, who so far had been completely absorbed in his work, is at last persuaded to escape from the office. Bride later recalls of Phillips that he was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt a great reverence to see him standing there sticking to his work while everybody was raging about. The 2 men burst through the door on the port side of the boat deck and take it all in. Bride remembered that there were people running all over the place and that from somewhere aft, the ship's orchestra was still playing jaunty ragtime music. Bride hears a call for help from above his head. It's Second Officer Lightoller, who needs more men to bodily move collapsible B down from the roof. He turns to help, but Phillips has left his side and run aft towards Titanic's stern. Bride will never see his friend again. Just behind Bride, around the second funnel, Titanic's band is preparing to play their last song. Band leader Wallace Hartley, 33, had once told a friend of his, who was another ship's musician, that he would play a hymn were he ever to be on a sinking ship. Having played cheery music all night, now the band begins to play a final, slow song as the chaos unfolds around them. The actual song chosen has been debated about for years. Harold Bride, about 100 feet away and busy helping free the collapsible boats, swears later in life that he heard the Song d'Automne, while others heard the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. But either way, the touching music is another ominous sign of impending doom, because now water has begun to roar up the A-deck promenade stairs leading up to the boat deck. First Officer William Murdoch and his men on the starboard side have cranked in the number 1 davit and prepared it to attach the falls to collapsible A. But now the time has come to get the boats down. Oars are rigged as spars to try to slide the boats down from the rooftop. On the starboard side, collapsible A thumps down with a boom and lands right side up on the deck, but on the other side, collapsible B collapses the spars under its massive weight and thunders onto the deck upside down. But now there's another problem. Titanic has taken on an enormous list to port, so now the area of the bridge and the boat deck around collapsible B is already beginning to dip underwater. White foam begins to swirl around the recently freed boat, and there's no time to flip it over and attach it for lowering because the ocean has already risen to meet it. The crowd of refugees from below turns to flee in terror and panic, heading for the fake safety of the stern, which is lifting higher into the air with every second. Collapsible B simply floats off the deck upside down as the ship begins to disappear beneath it. And trapped underneath the boat somehow is wireless operator Harold Bride. He'd helped get the thing off the roof, and now he's caught underneath it, inside an air pocket. On the starboard side, the men under Officer Murdoch are working desperately to sort out their own collapsible boat. Nobody's exactly sure of the plan. Murdoch had ordered the davits cranked in, and now men are working at untangling the falls and tackle and trying to connect them to the boat. Sixth Officer James Moody has other ideas. He calls out, "We don't want the block, we'll leave the boat on the deck." His idea is to simply let it float off, but others are still trying to connect the falls. They try pushing and pulling the boat up the deck towards the davits, but it's no use. The boat just weighs too much. Then, with a roar, the ocean bursts up and out of the stairs leading up to the boat deck, and the ocean has at last reached them. Some jump into the boat, but then somebody shouted out that the plug hadn't yet been put in. At sea, the plug was left out so that any rainwater could simply drain out, but now, without it, the lifeboat will be swamped. Fireman John Thompson, with injuries from a steam scalding earlier in the night, struggles desperately to get the plug back in. He feels the boat begin to be lifted by the surging, foaming water from underneath him. The dozens of passengers who'd come up from below have panicked and tried to flee aft, but they've encountered an unexpected barrier. Titanic's boat deck was a huge, open space, but it was segregated. The forward half was for the use of first-class passengers, while the after half was shared by second-class passengers and the ship's engineers. All these sections were separated by low railings with gates, and now the crowd of terrified passengers, some 100 or 200 in total, run up against the railings and get stuck. A crush develops, and there is no getting through. The time is now 2:15 AM, and across the ship mouths call out for help that couldn't come. The Carpathia is still miles away, making full steam, but with no hope of arriving in time. Titanic's stern is now high out in the air. She's down by the head by about 10 or 11 degrees, but she seems to hang there. It's all happening in slow motion. Around the collapsible A boat, people cling on for dear life as white water sweeps around their feet. The crowds along the promenade deck struggle desperately to try to get through towards the stern. Meanwhile, at the very stern of the ship, people hold railings and each other for support. The two priests are still saying their absolutions. Then, abruptly, the end comes for Titanic. From somewhere deep below, the final pockets of air which have given the ship her buoyancy finally give out. Her bow section drops like a stone. What has so far been a slowly rising tide of water becomes a tidal wave. It speeds up the boat deck, washing collapsible boat A up and off the deck for good, with whoever could cling onto it in tow. The wave smashes into the people who have got caught in the railings on the promenade deck, and it knocks anybody who was unprepared for it off their feet. One man who was prepared was Second Officer Charles Lightoller. After getting Collapsible B off the roof, he had been helping with the other boat when the ship simply sank out from underneath him. He thought briefly about turning to run for the stern, but realised that this was futile. Instead, he dives from the bridge front into the ocean and strikes out for the crow's nest, which by now is level with the waterline. But he realises that this too is futile because soon it will be underwater. He turns to swim back when he's suddenly pulled underwater and has the great misfortune of becoming pinned to the giant open mouth of one of the massive stokehold intake vents. These things lead all the way down to the boiler rooms, which are themselves a giant open space, and now tons and tons of seawater are pouring in and keeping Lytle stuck up against the grating. He begins to say his prayers knowing that he's finished, but then a burst of hot air from below spits him off the grating and sends him to the surface. Gasping, he emerges and begins to swim away from the suction. At the very stern, Frank Prentice and his mates have climbed over the portside railing as the crowds on deck jostle. The ship's angle is increasing all the time. Titanic is now about 13 or 14 degrees down by the head. It means that the poop deck, which once stood 4 or 5 stories out of the water, is now up at least 10 stories high. As Titanic rears higher and higher out of the water, everything movable inside her begins to crash down. Furniture, plates, decor. It creates a symphony of destruction as everything shatters and breaks. The promenade deck's ornate windows have met the water now. They too begin to shatter inwards because of the pressure difference. Frank Prentice and his friends realise that the time has come. If they hold off from jumping any longer, then the fall will kill them. Frank is holding onto one of the notice boards, which once warned other smaller vessels to stay away from the Titanic's propellers. He lets go and falls straight past those same propellers which now sit high in the air. He is extremely lucky, as even though he's wearing a life jacket, he hits the water and survives. Many who tried this were killed instantly when their life jackets smashed back into their heads on impact, breaking their necks. Frank's friend Cyril Ricks hit debris on the way down and was killed. Prentice now finds himself surrounded by bodies and debris, with the massive ship's stern looming dangerously over him. He begins to swim away. On the boat deck, people are struggling to still rush afterwards for safety, while around the base of the forward funnel they swarm, caught off guard by the sudden plunge. They're swimming for nowhere in particular. Charles Lightoller was among them. He had survived being pinned to the vent intake and then emerged at the surface. Now he swims back for Collapsible B and holds on. But then there is a loud crack like a gunshot. And then another one. The steel cable stays that connected Titanic's forward funnel to the boat deck are beginning to part ways. The funnel begins to lumber through the air like a drunk. It's coming down. It had actually been quite well supported against the forward angle because, by nature, it was angled itself backwards by about 3 or 4 degrees to help clear soot up and over the decks. But now, tons of water are pressing at its base. It's made of only thin steel plating, and it was never designed to survive this kind of pressure. The thing is 4 or 5 stories tall, and by itself weighs tons. It comes down with a roar onto the heads of dozens of people who are swimming in the water. One of them is Charles Dwayne Williams. His son Richard is just feet away when the funnel comes crashing down and crushes him. Richard was transfixed by the sight, recalling later that it wasn't because of the fact it had killed his father and missed him by mere feet, but because he was wondering at the enormous size of the funnel which still belched smoke. The forward funnel smashed into the ocean and created a huge wave which washed over Collapsible B and sent it away from the ship. Collapsible A was caught up in the wave too. It was sent spinning away like a toy, smashing into one of the lifeboat davits, causing one fireman to break his arm. The funnel broke loose and rolled off into the water, sinking, creating a new horror. Where it had once stood was now an open moor 25 feet across, a blank shaft that led deep into the bowels of the ship. Water now roared in and carried anybody close enough nearby with it into a swirling, hellish whirlpool. Then it's funnel number 2's turn. With a whoosh and a brilliant explosion of sparks from below, it smashes down into the water. The time is 2:17 a.m. and Titanic is dying. To the growing din of smashing glassware and windows comes a new noise, a dull roar. To some, it sounds like a passing locomotive in a subway. Some even mistake it to be the ship's machinery and boilers becoming unseated and crashing forward through the bulkheads, but that's not it. The noise begins to reach a crescendo. It's actually the Titanic's steel structure beginning to fail. Individual beams and columns are bent and begin to crack. Hull plating is tearing, rivets are popping, wood paneling is shattering. Under the strain, steam lines and pipes crack and burst. The lights, which have stayed on so far all night, are powered by steam dynamos. Without their supply of steam, they begin to wind down, and the lights snap off. Then, it happens. Titanic's weakened structure fails. The entire hull comes apart down to the waterline. With a sound like rolling thunder, her back is broken. The stern comes down into the water again, although more gently than you might expect. Some don't even ever see the ship break in two, although many do. Their testimony at future inquiries will eventually be ignored. The pride of British shipbuilding could not simply break in two, but it just did. Only hours earlier, the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, had told passengers that Titanic could be broken into sections and then those individual sections could remain afloat. But now his theory is about to be put to the test in the most horrifying way possible. His ship is rent apart. Funnel number 3 is caught off balance and tumbles off the ship, but funnel number 4 gets caught on the boat deck and stays in place after it collapses. Titanic's stern comes down almost level with the water again, and many think that it's returned to normal trim and will stay afloat. It stays there for a few long seconds, but then begins to rear up again. The break isn't a clean one. Sections of the lower hull remain intact. Plating, steel stringers and frames, the keel and the double bottom. Titanic's skeleton is strong, and it hasn't yet completely failed, but where the stern isn't flooded yet and full of air, the bow is now hundreds of thousands of tons of waterlogged dead weight. It is dropping for the sea floor like a stone and pulling the stern down with it. Holding on for dear life as the gargantuan stern section begins to whirl through the air is Chief Baker Charles Jochen. He clings to the starboard railing as the stern section is pulled down further and further and the angle increases in severity. Those in the lifeboats and the drifting collapsibles watch in shock as the stern rises up, twisting in a kind of semicircle. The stern is still full of air. It should take a long time to sink, but now it's being pulled down into the ocean as if a giant hand was grabbing it from below. Maybe the bow section remained attached, or maybe it was the enormous weight of her engines and machinery which still remained bolted in place. But either way, the stern now succumbs to the sea and gradually, calmly, begins to slip under. For those in the lifeboats, it looked elegant. 21-year-old steward Cecil Fitzpatrick later recalls that it was as neat and as clean a dive as was ever made by a fish. But inside the ship, the Final Plunge is anything but gentle. Tons of seawater surge unimpeded throughout. Wooden bulkheads and cabin partitions are demolished by a tsunami of ocean water. Boiling white water consumes the ship's poop deck, and Baker Charles Jochen lets go as it swirls around his waist. He barely gets his hair wet as the ship disappears from under him. The fantail goes under, and then the jackstaff, which once proudly flew the ship's blue ensign flag. There is a slight gulp. The time is about 2:20 a.m, and Titanic is gone. Left behind are hundreds of people who struggle in the water and call for help. From below there comes the sound of loud booms as the stern section, which is still not completely full of air, begins to implode. Decades later, when the wreckage is found, that stern section will be almost unrecognizable because of its violent end. The conditions in the water in the immediate aftermath of Titanic's sinking are later described by Charles Lightoller as being an utter nightmare of both sight and sound. Whether it was escaping coal dust or soot from the boilers, a dark haze settles over the scene after Titanic sinks, and then wreckage begins to burst through the surface from below. From the water, only about 40 to 50 will be saved by various means, including Frank Prentice. He's pulled aboard Lifeboat 4 and survives the night. So too does Charles Jochen and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. He leads a group of desperate survivors who balance precariously atop Collapsible B all night, working to shift their body weight against the waves to prevent their small boat from rolling over. Wireless operator Harold Bride eventually emerges from beneath the boat and clambers aboard. He's frozen nearly solid, but he's safe. All around, hundreds of desperate passengers call out for help, but help is too far away. Carpathia is still hours from Titanic's last known position. The screams will go unheeded into the night. Two o'clock a.m. in a dense, soupy fog on the St. Lawrence River, and a ship is dying. The Empress of Ireland, pride of the Canadian Pacific Railway line, has encountered another ship in the murky dark. The collier Storstad has plunged its reinforced bow deep inside the Empress's hull with the deadly efficiency of an assassin's stiletto. The blow had struck between two critical compartments, the boiler rooms, which flooded so rapidly that many passengers asleep nearby were caught out in their cabins by a wall of white water. There was no hope for escape, and now there plays out a desperate struggle for survival as the ship's starboard side dips closer and closer to the river's surface. It's painfully clear that the end is coming. At the lifeboats, officers and crew fight desperately to get the davits swung out and the boats away, but water creeps closer and closer. Then, with a flash, the lights across the liner die out, plunging it and the nearly 1,500 people aboard into near-perfect darkness. There are only minutes left, and the Empress of Ireland is about to take its final plunge. The Empress lists and sags heavily in the water. The gash ripped in her side is letting in around 250 tons of the St. Lawrence's chilly water every second. It leaves the ship's crew with very little time and opportunity to save their passengers, let alone their ship, but they spring into action regardless. Chief Officer Mansfield Steed is a strange sight. He's stood, clad in his pajamas, desperately directing the unlashing and swinging out of lifeboats on the liner's starboard side. The boat deck has become clogged with passengers lucky enough to have made it topside, mostly first and second class. Steerage has not been so lucky. Down there is the very picture of hell. With the ship's lights extinguished when the dynamos had been inundated with water, people who'd been asleep only moments before could just grope for rescue in the darkness or fumble with matches. The inside of their ship has become a blackened out maze of winding hallways and staircases that become steeper and more treacherous as the list grows worse. There had been 3 night duty stewards in third class whose job it had been to oversee the steerage quarters over the long, boring hours at night. They had suddenly been confronted in the middle of their shift with a torrent of water. Maybe they rushed to crank shut the watertight doors at their stations as they'd been trained to do, or they might have tried to light the emergency oil lamps. We'll never know, because not a single one of them survived. On the decks above, night watchmen and the other classes, like Leonard Powell, rushed to and fro as the decks beneath them began to slump, lighting emergency lamps, around 8 in total it's thought, so the passengers who were lucky enough to be berthed higher up in the hull made it out in the nick of time. In just a few minutes, the many staircases throughout the ship will become unusable. It will be impossible to walk without standing on what had once been the bulkheads or the walls. On the boat deck, Steed and his men bodily haul the big steel ship's boats out of their chocks and over the side of the superstructure, which usually towered high but now was beginning to nearly kiss the St. Lawrence, a sure portent of imminent doom. From the bridge, Captain Kendall bellows orders through his speaking trumpet, frustratingly ineffectual over the din of the panicked passengers, the grunts of the struggling crew at the lifeboats, and the groaning of his own ship underfoot. Kendall had been the star of the Canadian Pacific Line, an overnight celebrity when he had stopped a murderer from fleeing for safety aboard his ship. Now he watched on as his newest command, one of the finest in the company, was dying in front of him. He had telegraphed down to run the engines ahead to try to beach her, but there was no steam pressure left. The little arrows on the telegraphs pointed pathetically at full ahead, but the engine's crankshafts lay silent and immobile. Those telegraph arrows would still be pointing to full ahead over 110 years later. So the Empress wasn't moving, but it must have shocked even Kendall how quickly she was going down. The ship had been built with all the modern safety features: watertight bulkheads dividing her into compartments, a double bottom to protect against grounding, thick steel doors to shut and check the flow of water throughout the ship. But the Empress's compartments were big, too big, and the margin of buoyancy slim. The watertight doors were well and good in theory, but they relied on a system where they had to be closed by hand. In the event, her crew simply had no chance. Anybody that tried, deep in the heart of the liner, was overcome and drowned. Kendall gripped his ship with one hand and the speaking trumpet with the other as the Empress rolled around him. Among the throng of frightened passengers stood John Delamont, his wife Seraphine, and their 3 children. The husband and wife were a pair of Salvation Army members on board, about 170 in total, who were on their way to a great congress in London. John and his 2 sons had been birthed far away from Seraphine and Elizabeth. When the impact had occurred, John and the boys had been rattled awake, then dressed quickly, lifebelts on, and rushed aft to find the others. They found the cabin locked or the door jammed. Either way, it didn't matter to John. He threw his weight at it and broke it open by force. The group had hurried topside and made it out just in time to join the crowd that stood waiting nervously for the boats to be got away. But feeling the deck surge to starboard underfoot, they struggled to the port side to wait there instead. The sight that met them was pitiful. Crew struggled to push the boats out and over the side of the ship that was now raised so high in the air the boats could only swing back inwards. It was like a Sisyphean struggle. Any boat that was lowered on that side anyway would be flipped or dashed to pieces on the ship's bulging rivet heads as it scraped its way along the hull. None of them could be launched. On the other side, there was more success. Chief Officer Steed knew his work well. Somehow, his ragtag group of crewmen, many still in their nightclothes like he was, had managed to fumble about in the dark with enough skill to get some of the boats swung out and ready to load. Women and children first, be damned. This was a struggle for survival. There was just no time. Men, women, and children desperately crowded in, but the readying and lowering of boats was not Chief Officer Steed's only contribution that night. When the impact had been felt, and Steed had been woken with a start from his bunk, he'd instinctively rushed aft to Ronald Ferguson, the Chief Marconi telegraph operator. Ferguson had been in his bunk too when he felt the jolt. He himself rushed to his set and alerted any nearby stations that something was wrong. "Stand by for a distress call," he had said. "We've struck something." But being a wireless operator, it was not his call to send an SOS. He'd need to find an officer for approval or wait for orders. But fortunately, one was at hand. Steed had practically burst through the door to give the order without even having spoken with the captain yet. Thanks to those men, the Empress gave out a short distress call before her voice died altogether when the steam ran out, but help was on the way. Steed and others, including First Officer Edward Jones and Second Officer Roger Williams, worked to fill the lifeboats. Lifeboat 1 had been just 4 feet above the water when it drifted clear of the ship. Lifeboat 3 gets away too, even after a handful of men have jumped in at the last possible second. Boat 13 is less fortunate. In the haste of the unfolding disaster, it's got stuck against a davit and broken free with a violent lurch that spills passengers out into the water below. It recovers and starts down again, only to be nearly toppled once more by people jumping in from above. At the stern, hundreds of feet away, people grapple with the hooks, blocks and falls for boat 16 on the port side and 15 on the starboard. But like the others on that side, boat 16 is left in place. It's just too late to get it out and over, but 15 is now sagging closer and closer to the water. The davits are swung out, a crowd surges into the boat and it jerks down towards the river, but then it too fouls somehow and turns over with a lunge that spills its occupants out into the water. It lands on top of them, upside down, with no hope of righting. Down below deck, water roars in faster and faster as more of the great hole on the ship's side is pulled under. Any open portholes only add to the speed that she sinks. Soon, the promenade decks have water spilling over their scuppers and bulwarks and running the length of them. Time is quickly running out, and the Empress is leaning over at something like 30 degrees. Inside the ship, the once grand interiors have become an impassable obstacle course. The grand staircase in first class, with its landings, is now a hopeless affair because the slippery tiled floors and sharply angled stairs are nearly impossible to climb. The walls on the left-hand side of the ship are quickly becoming something more like a ceiling. Doors to the outside world now hang ominously above people's heads as they struggle to climb up. Outside, in the cold, foggy air, Lifeboat 5 somehow clears the ship. It doesn't even need to be lowered down. The boat hooks detach and it just floats away cleanly because the water has already reached the boat deck itself. Captain Kendall must have watched with agonizing, frozen fascination as his ship slowly succumbed and the angle grew worse and worse. Miraculously, the crew also managed to get Lifeboat 11 away, loaded heavily with around 40 people. It floats slowly off, but the ship's towering funnels loom terrifyingly overhead. From deep within the ship trudges a motley assortment of firemen and engineers who have climbed the emergency escape ladders and emerge at the base of the ship's after funnel, abandoning their posts for a shot at survival. But with the boiler and engine rooms now deeply underwater, they surely can't be blamed for that at all. The Empress has reached an impossible angle, nearing 40 degrees or more. Those working at the boats now cannot do so without holding on with one hand at least. And then suddenly, the end comes. Its starting pistol is a deep, resounding boom, the death throes of a giant, a steam explosion somewhere deep within that shudders the dying ship's structure and resonates like rolling thunder. With that, the list begins to get suddenly greater, and the Empress begins to roll. On the boat deck, First Officer Edward Jones has been fighting to get Boat 7 filled and away. But behind him, funnel number 2 begins to drop down straight for him. He and his men have run out of time. They're swept away by a surging wave as it crashes up the boat deck. Jones plunges into the cold water, and Boat 7 goes down. The engineers, who have really only just emerged from within, urgently grip onto the base of the king posts, the tall masts used for loading cargo. The Empress's port side now lifts high into the air, but all the equipment stored up there begins to rain down with deadly effect. Lifeboats and rafts, oars, spars, blocks, tackle, winches, and people. It all comes crashing down with a thunderous roar that drowns out the cries of stunned humanity below. As the Empress comes hurtling down into the water, onto her side, her 2 massive funnels slap the river surface with a terrific impact that shoots coal dust and sparks out. but not before one clips Lifeboat 11 with its nearly 2 dozen occupants. The boat is crushed like it had been struck by some giant's fist. Boat 1 narrowly misses being crushed by the forward funnel 2, only to be suddenly hit by the Marconi wireless antennas strung between the masts. The occupants struggle quickly to untangle their boat before it's dragged under, and they get away. Dozens and dozens of people find themselves suddenly treading water, with the hulk of the Empress of Ireland looming directly overhead. Pieces still come off and rain down. The enormous cargo derricks break free, and one smashes down into the water right on top of Chief Officer Steed, and he's killed instantly. All around, there are surreal sights. Some of the engineers managed to climb the king posts like monkeys, and now the posts are horizontal and the men can crawl along them. One of them is the chief engineer, Sampson. He and his men had tried to save the ship, rushing to shut watertight doors and get steam into the engines, but it had been a hopeless task. As Sampson tries to make his way along the precarious king post, a clatter sounds from above, and he's clipped by falling debris, plunging into the water below. Elsewhere, Captain Kendall re-emerges cold, wet, and a little worse for wear. As the ship rolled, he was thrown bodily into a telegraph and over the side. Stunned for a moment, he gathers himself, looks around for a lifeboat to re-establish command. As the Empress settles onto her starboard side, there is a whoosh as the great mouths of the funnels meet the river's surface. They lead into uptakes, which funnel smoke, fumes and gases from the boilers, stories below in the ship's bowels. But now, water begins to surge in like a raging whirlpool, taking debris and people with it. An officer, maybe Second Officer Williams, fights the current in vain. He screams, but he's taken down into the black maw of a funnel top. High on the port side, now lifted stories into the air, men and women cling on for dear life to the railing they'd been gripping when the ship had started to go. But one by one, their strength gives out. They drop to bounce sickeningly off the vents and structures on the far side of the ship before splashing down into the river. From above roar down the portside lifeboats, which were never launched. Their lines crack as they break, and the boats, each a few tons in weight, thunder down onto the heads of people below. It's a scene of indescribable chaos and suffering. Probably the most strange sight of all can be seen on the Empress's overturned hull, because a handful of people were quick enough to scramble with the ship as it rolled, so they've ended up safely on its side. Among them is the Delamont family, John, Seraphine and their children. Leonard, one of the boys, takes off his cork life jacket and gives it to his mother instead. John Delamont is confronted with a sudden, terrifying reality. He can't swim. But the Empress stays there, seemingly suspended, sitting pathetically on her side. Some even think, optimistically, that she might be grounded on the river bottom and can't sink, but it's a forlorn hope. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the black river water begins to creep up the hull, and each wave laps slightly higher than the last. The portholes hiss as air is forced out in huge volumes by the inrush of water, and the Empress is going down. The water around the sinking Empress is filled with people who flail wildly, unable, like John Delamont, to swim. Some have suffered blows to the head and are dazed or concussed. So much debris rained down when the ship rolled that many victims are dead because of blunt force trauma. Others have survived only with broken bones. But surviving the sinking ship is one thing. Now, those unfortunates are faced with making it through the bitter, numbing cold. It's late May, spring, but the river water is 2.2 degrees Celsius or 36 Fahrenheit. It saps the energy from competent swimmers as well as it does from those that aimlessly struggle just to tread water. Like Titanic's victims 2 years before, they begin to go numb and lose consciousness as the cold chokes the life from them. The lucky ones find their way to boats or floating debris. First-class passenger George Smart had floated for agonizing minutes, clinging to debris, before being pulled aboard a half-submerged collapsible boat that had floated off the wreck by itself. He was so stunned by the awful cold, he couldn't take it all in. Another passenger, Lionel Kent, had struck out swimming for what he thought was a small island, but was actually a heavily laden boat. Someone reached for his hand, but he was so drained by the cold he couldn't even lift it up to reach. They hauled him out of the water regardless and set about reviving him. Some of the first-class passengers, awakened not by the impact of the collision, but the braying of the ship's whistles, dressed completely before heading out. One is Tyria Townsend, who completed her ensemble with a heavy overcoat and laced-up boots. She was nearly drowned because of it, but saved by a man, Clayton Burt, who just earlier that night had been her dinner table companion in the saloon. Others pull off a minor miracle. They swim for the ship that had hit their own. The Storstad had emerged from the fog and struck the Empress plumb on her starboard side. It had then drifted off into the murk and was obscured by the fog. But incredibly, as soon as the Empress went over and sank, the cloud of fog was blown away. Maybe by the rush of air from deep within the Empress as she sank, so the Storstad's reassuring lights came clearly into view. A number of swimmers strike out for the big ship and its promise of rescue, led by an anonymous passenger who called out encouragement and drove them forward. Not many made it, but those who did owed it to the man who had cheered them on. Nobody knew who he was, because he never made it himself. They came aboard the Storstad dripping wet and miserable, arms and legs numbed by the cold to the point of uselessness. For their part, the crew of the Storstad had got their boats into the water and rushed out to do all that they could. Miraculously, one of those pulled from the water is Chief Engineer Sampson. He's survived the impact of debris and his fall into the water, and he's hurried aboard the Storstad into that ship's Chief Engineer's cabin. Back on the overturned hull of the Empress, passengers mill about. The entire scene is bathed in an eerie, ethereal blue glow, thanks to life preservers coated in a chemical mixture designed to burn on contact with the water. The end is clearly coming now. It's obvious the water is rising higher and higher up the hull. The choice is simply to stay and wait or to jump in now and get on with it. Many choose the latter. One is young Leonard Delamont. He turns to his mother, who he has just given his life jacket to, and kisses her on the cheek. With that, he leaps from the side of the ship, leaving his family behind, but he's never seen again. Around the Delamonts, a strange, disturbing scene is playing out. Either people had slept through the disaster until it was too late, thrown from their bunks by the rolling of the ship, or some had just groped through the darkened hull only to find themselves in port-side cabins and public rooms. Either way, the end result is the same. From open portholes, there come waving hands. The frames of the portholes are just far too small for most average-sized people to squeeze through. Dr. James Grant is the ship's surgeon. He had slept through the entire ordeal before being thrown out of bed when the Empress had rolled. To his horror, the corridors and entrances that led outside on deck were lifted high above his head, and he had to crawl on hand and knee, digging his fingernails into the carpet. He hauled himself up, gripping anything he could, beams, panels, doorknobs, until he reached a porthole that had once been on the ship's port side and was now essentially on the ceiling. He lifted his head through and called for help. Some of those standing on the hull rushed to his aid, and they actually managed to pull him through with a heave. But others aren't so lucky. They wave in vain, tragically in vain, because the water surges slowly along the hull and drags them under. In the weeks to come, recovery divers will find them still stuck halfway out the brass portholes. People on the overturned hull of the Empress simply begin to step off and into the river. There's no need to dive in now because the ship is slowly vanishing under and the water is rising gradually up like the tide at a beach. The scene of strange, orderly calm changes suddenly when there is a loud boom and the ship's hull ruptures near the engine room. Unable to exhaust out the ship's funnels, which are now underwater, whatever steam was still in the lines has built up enough pressure to detonate outwards with a loud roar. It creates a blast that escapes through the shell plating and throws bystanders up to 50 feet away from the sinking ship. Smoke and steam rushes out into the night, creating a kind of mushroom cloud, and the ship begins to drop faster. On the small section of hull still above the water, the Delamonts are frozen in fear, but the water surges around their feet, and they've run out of time. They're dragged under. The Empress finally disappears beneath the surface, but she's not yet filled completely with water. Pockets inside the hull are still filling and water roars in with all the force of a great waterfall. It creates a vortex on the surface that sucks people down with her, the Delamonts included. Seconds must have felt like hours in that blind panic, but then the current is reversed. A massive volume of water, about 20,000 tons of it, was displaced by the Empress's hull. It surges in behind and then rockets back up towards the surface, blasting dozens of people who were drawn in behind the ship back up, mercifully, for air, creating a series of tidal waves that washes boats and people away into the night in the process. John Delamont sputters water out and gasps for air at the surface. He's surrounded by hundreds of people, alive, dead, something in between. The cold is stunning, and Delamont can't swim, but by some miracle he reaches a piece of debris and holds on for dear life. In the darkness, as he calls for help, his wife and daughter hear his voice and they recognize it. They all find each other and cling on for life. Elizabeth's hair has been torn from her head by another struggling survivor who had clawed at her for buoyancy, but she is alive, and so too are her mother, father, and one of her brothers. They make it through the night, treading water for over an hour, a miracle in itself, given the frigid temperatures of the water, but as they clung together, waiting for rescue, directly beneath them, the Empress of Ireland dropped into her grave. May 7th, 1915. It's a fine, sunny day, and the RMS Lusitania is steaming off the coast of Ireland. She's bound for Liverpool, but she's in a precarious position. The ocean is full of German submarines, the infamous U-boats which have been patrolling Allied ships with devastating efficiency. Lusitania is under the command of Captain William Turner, a veteran of the Cunard Line and something of a gruff old sea dog. He's navigated his ship across the Atlantic Ocean and arrived off Ireland as expected, but now he must time his arrival into Liverpool with the tides. Too early an arrival, and Lusitania won't be able to enter the River Mersey. Stopped at the river's mouth, she'd be a sitting duck. Better to stay out at sea and slow her speed so she'll arrive right on time. But Lusitania's greatest defense against German submarines is her speed. Steaming along at around 18 knots compared to her usual 24, Lusitania is still faster than a submerged German U-boat, but then there's a cry from the ship's bow. A torpedo is bearing down on the great Oceanliner, and it's too late to try to get away. Turner's worst fears have come true, and his ship is under attack. Lusitania had received a direct hit just below the bridge. The torpedo had an explosive charge, the equivalent of 162 kilograms or 360 pounds of TNT, and the impact was devastating. Straight away, the ship began to list heavily onto her side and drop by the head. Captain Turner in the bridge ordered an emergency maneuver, an attempted turn towards the Irish coast and a possible beaching, but it was too late. His ship was already in her death throes. And then, just minutes after that, the ship's power had failed and her lights went out. Outside, it's a lovely sunny day. But inside, the ship's cavernous interior has been plunged into blackness. The stage is set for a terrible, epic struggle for survival as hundreds of people are suddenly confronted with the horrifying realities of wartime. They don't have much time, because Lusitania is entering her final plunge. In the wireless room, 20-year-old assistant radio man David McCormick had been at the telegraph when the torpedo hit, and upon feeling the impact under his feet, he and Chief Radio Operator Robert Leith instinctively knew what had happened. Leith, a Liverpudlian, had actually seen Lusitania slip out of Liverpool on her maiden voyage way back in 1907, and now he was responsible for rapidly coordinating a rescue. He had just sat down for lunch when he felt the detonation from below, and he rushed upstairs to the wireless office, and without orders, took over from McCormick and started tapping out an urgent message. "Come at once," he said. "Big list, 10 miles south of the old head of Kinsale." But then the wireless set's power began to falter. The ammeter needle dropped to 0, and the power had died. McCormick fired up the emergency dynamo, which ran on battery power, and Leith got back to work again, calling for help. Immediately after the torpedo impact, all across the ship there had been a deep air of confusion, but just minutes later, with the lights dead and the ship's bow plunging into the ocean, panic had begun to take hold. First-class passenger Oliver Percy Bernard had been on deck when the torpedo hit. He is travelling with Leslie Mason, his boss's daughter, and her husband Stuart. Leslie was beside herself with concern because Stuart was nowhere to be seen. Bernard told her to sit tight while he ran below to look for her husband. On his way, he overheard officers ordering people away from the lifeboats as they awaited orders from Captain Turner to abandon ship, but then he was confronted with a horrifying sound. People inside, trapped in elevators, calling for help. The power was out, and there was nothing Bernard could do. He headed for the Mason's cabin, but Stuart was nowhere to be seen. Now, he is rushed back on deck and bursts through the entrance, but now Leslie has gone too. He's surrounded by chaos and confusion, and a woman snatches the life belt he's carrying from out of his hands. Around Bernard and across the ship, crew begin to work to free and lower the lifeboats. But now, with Lusitania's bow dropping like a stone and the ship at a sharp angle, this is a tougher task than they could have ever imagined. Just days earlier, a half-hearted lifeboat drill had taken place. Lifeboat crews had arrived at their boats, got in, and then simply hopped back out. No attempt at lowering was ever made. But now, the crew are faced with the daunting task of lowering the heavy wooden boats against the listing ship. On the port side, Staff Captain James "Jock" Anderson is in charge of lowering the boats. Minutes earlier, women and children had piled in and patiently awaited lowering away, but the list meant the boats were swinging inwards and couldn't be launched. He ordered all the women and children out. In his mind, despite the dramatic list, Lusitania's damage should be contained by the watertight bulkheads and doors. He thinks she is just flooded and her trim is out of whack. He tells the junior third officer to report to the bridge and order that the portside tanks be flooded to straighten her out. He turns to the passengers waiting in front of him and tells them that there is no danger and the ship is not going to sink. On the starboard side, though, it's a very different story. Here, the water is roaring up just feet away, and the rush to escape the ship becomes a desperate fight for survival. The same list which has swung the portside boats in is causing the starboard boats to swing out away from the ship, so deck chairs have to be laid down so that passengers can span the huge gap. Lifeboat 17 is filling up quickly with passengers. Third-class passenger Elizabeth Duckworth has just got her friend Alice Scott's son away in another boat, but there wasn't room for the two women, so they climb instead into boat 17. Nearby, Professor Ian Holborn had befriended 12-year-old Ava's dolphin on the voyage. Now he sees to it that she and two of her travelling companions are put into the same boat. All seems well, but then the crew have trouble with the boat's launching tackle. At the last minute, Elizabeth Duckworth gets spooked. She jumps out of the boat and back onto the deck. Boat 17 lowers away, but just before it reaches the water, it capsizes and spills its entire complement out into the ocean. Many can't swim, and they're dragged down by the weight of their heavy woolen clothes. Up in the wireless room, Leith and McCormick have had to start to brace themselves against the list of the ship. If it gets any worse, Leith will be thrown out of his chair. They realise that there's nothing for it. They'll have to try to make an escape. They burst through the wireless officer's door to find the ship beginning to plunge beneath the ocean. Just outside the office is first-class passenger Oliver Bernard. He couldn't find Leslie Mason nor her husband Stuart, and instead he instinctively has climbed to the upper deck to get away from the confusion and the chaos. McCormick offers Bernard a wooden chair as it may float in the water. It's obvious that soon the men will need all the flotation they can get. "Here's something for you to hang on to, sir," McCormick says. But Bernard politely declines the offer and the chair slides across the deck and crashes into the railing. The whole thing seems surreal. McCormick gets down on hands and knees to take a photograph on his pocket camera. "What a snap this will make," he says. On the port side, Staff Captain Anderson still holds off on lowering the boats. He calls out, "Don't lower the boats! Don't lower the boats! The ship can't sink! Will the gentlemen kindly assist me in getting the women and children out of the boats and off the upper deck?" But as concern begins to mount, his orders are being ignored. Boat 10 is lowering away. It struggles down the ship's hull, bumping and grinding along rivets and plates the whole way before it snags, breaks from its lines, and smashes into the ocean with its full complement of passengers. Survivors come up gasping for air, but then from above, there's another crashing sound. Lifeboat 12 suffers the same fate, but now it and its occupants come crashing down onto the heads of Boat 10's people in the water. Further down the boat deck, a standoff is playing out. First-class passenger Isaac Lehman had made his way to the boat deck. He came across Boat 18, sitting idle with about 24 or so nervous passengers on board and a small crowd standing around it. The crew stood around, seemingly equally as nervous, seeing the other boats plummeting down the ship's side. They are reluctant to suffer the same fate and are frozen in indecision. Lusitania is diving downwards quicker and quicker, and Lehman realizes this. He grabs the nearest sailor and shouts, "Why aren't you putting this boat into the water? Who has charge of this lifeboat?" The seaman responds, "It's the captain's orders not to launch any boats." But furious and desperate, knowing the Lusitania is approaching its final moments, Lehman takes out his revolver from his pocket and waves it in plain sight, and he roars his orders. "To hell with the captain," he says. "Don't you see the boat is sinking? And the first man that disobeys my order to launch this boat, I shoot to kill." The sailor is shocked, but he springs into action. He swings his axe to release the pin that's holding the lifeboat in place. But Lehman's rash orders have unintended consequences. The lifeboat swings freely through the air, but the dangerous list of the ship causes it not to go over the side, but to plunge inboard. The hapless crowd of people are standing in its path, and the boat cleaves its way through them and crushes them against the smoking room's deckhouse. Many are badly injured or killed outright, and Lehman himself is caught by the boat's violent motion and his leg is badly smashed. He notices that he's covered in blood, but it may not necessarily be his. Meanwhile, on the starboard side, Boat 3 is loaded with passengers and lowered down. First-class passengers Charles and Mabel Learoyd are travelling with their Australian-made Margaret. Immediately after the torpedo's impact, it had been difficult for Mabel to even climb the ship's first-class staircase, such was the severity of the list. She was then confronted by a horrifying sight, water pouring into the dining saloon, possibly through open portholes. She and her husband found their way to the boat deck, and now, with the ship foundering, they step into Boat 3. It reaches the water, but then, from above, another boat, possibly a collapsible, is lowered right onto their heads. Boat 3 capsizes and throws the Learoyds and the rest of the passengers into the water. Mabel is held underwater for agonizing seconds before she bursts to the surface again, but she has lost sight of her husband. As the great ship sinks behind her, she begins to frantically search, but she will never see him again. Further aft, away from the carnage and despair as the lifeboats are smashed or overturned, theatre manager Charles Frohman is making no effort to save himself. He was heading to Britain to see European play markets and productions, which was a regular exercise for him. He is a humble, quiet man, but a sharp wit and an astute businessman. Playwright and intimate friend Paul Potter had seen him off at the quay as Lusitania was departing. "Aren't you afraid of the U-boats?" he'd asked. Frohman had smiled and simply said, "No, I'm only afraid of the IOUs." Now, with Lusitania dropping beneath his feet, Frohman is standing, chatting with friends by the veranda cafe. He is nonchalant, smoking a cigar, and he's surprised at the attack. "I didn't think they would do it," he says. Rita Jolivet, an actress, joins the group. Frohman tells her to hold onto the railing and save her strength, but as the list beneath his feet gets worse and screams begin to emanate from the crashing lifeboats, the horrifying reality of the situation begins to dawn on them. Frohman cheerfully smiles and paraphrases from his most successful theatre production, Peter Pan. "Why fear death?" he says. "It is the most beautiful adventure." Rita has a terrifying realization. Frohman relies on a cane for mobility. He'll be helpless in the water. Almost prophetically, water begins to surge up the boat deck heading towards them, and Lusitania's end is nigh. Back at Boat 18, the awful results of the crushing incident have to be ignored for now. Injured passengers are bodily heaved in, and the crew somehow get control of the boat and prepare it for lowering. They release the falls, but they do it too quickly. The boat bounces along the ship's hull. "Don't you drop this boat," shouts a man from on board. But then the falls run out, and it drops out of control. Boat 18 slams into the water's surface, spilling everyone inside out and into the ocean. Isaac Lehman had stayed behind, and he grips onto a railing, holding on for dear life, with his crushed foot in some agony. Forward, just astride the second funnel, Lifeboat 7 is being prepared for lowering, but the ocean is roaring up the boat deck, and time has run out. First-class passenger Emilius Laureate is there. He was an experienced transatlantic traveller, a businessman, and this trip had been routine for him. He'd actually got caught inside the ship as the power cut out, but fortunately was able to use his pocket matches to light the way and get out of the pitch-black interior. Now he's at Lifeboat 7, helping load it and prepare it for lowering. He's helping a steward cut away at the falls with a pocket knife to help the lifeboat free, but he has a horrifying realization. A wave has begun to roar up towards them, and towering overhead is one of the monstrous funnels, some 4 stories tall. Laureate stops what he's doing and jumps out, and he pleads for the others to do so. They've run out of time, and there's no chance of getting the boat away. A few get out, but many more stay behind. Laureate jumps into the ocean and looks back to see Boat 7 and its screaming occupants dragged underwater as the ship plunges downward. At the wireless office, Leith, McCormick and Bernard see an opportunity to escape. Boat 11 sits in its davits empty, save for one man hacking away at the ropes with his penknife. An attempt at launching had just been tried, but the boat had capsized and dropped its occupants into the sea. And now the ocean has risen to meet the boat where it sits on the boat deck, and there can be no delay. Leith jumps in to help, and so does Oliver Bernard, who begins to help others in. Water begins to surge up the boat deck and swirl under Boat 11, but by some miracle, the falls are released, and the lifeboat begins to float off the deck. McCormick, meanwhile, stays on the ship. After watching the lifeboats crushed, flipped, or sunk, he wants to take his chances swimming or finding something to hold on to. He dives into the sea, but the camera in his pocket is submerged too, and it ruins the photos that he had taken of the sinking. Those left aboard have begun to instinctively run for higher ground. Lusitania's stern is now rising high out of the water, and her 4 gleaming bronze propellers are pointing towards the sky. Passengers swarm atop the tall second-class deckhouse, which rises above the ship's stern. Here, on top, are the lifeboats 21 and 22. 22 is left in place. Lowering against the list of the ship is an impossibility, but 21 is filled and lowered away as the ship's stern swings wildly into the air. Somehow the lifeboat survives its wild flight and gets away as the dying ship begins to slide under for good. Lusitania is 787 feet, or 240 meters long, but the stretch of water she is sinking in is only 93 meters, or 302 feet deep. From far below, there is a deep booming sound and a groan as the great ship's bow, hundreds of feet underwater, strikes the sea floor with a crunch. The bow plates twist and buckle, and the ship's stern begins now to drop like a stone. Slowly, the deck houses and the ornate public rooms are consumed by boiling white water. Aft, at the Veranda Cafe, Rita Jolivet is holding onto the railing and Charles Frohman when the surging ocean rises to meet her. Rita goes on to describe it as a green cliff of water. The group is separated, and Rita is pulled down violently, so violently that her tightly laced boots are simply pulled from right off her feet. She rises up, but she's pulled under again by the suction, and this happens a few more times. The story is the same for Isaac Lehman. He was clinging onto the railing, his foot a damaged mess, when the seawater roared over the deckhouse behind him and pulled him under. But somehow he and Rita both come up to the surface for good, and they watch in awe as Lusitania's stern drops straight down. Charles Laureate had narrowly escaped being pulled down by Lifeboat 7, but now there is another danger headed his way. The wireless antenna, strung between the ship's masts and usually 180 feet or 55 meters clear above the waterline, now slaps down into the ocean around him. Some others are hit by the heavy steel cables, and Laureate feels it clip his shoulder and spin him upside down. He struggles for his life and breaks free, bursting to the surface again, and he swims frantically for a lifeboat. Laureate isn't the only one hit by debris or parts of the ship as she goes down. Lifeboat 15's launch had been left to the absolute last second. The boat was washed bodily across the boat deck and straight into the support cables for funnel number 3. As the ship sank around them, the huge funnel loomed overhead, and many in the boat thought it was going to crush them. A few jumped into the water to swim away, but then, at the last second, Lusitania seemed to roll away, and boat 15 was freed. But now, just seconds later, as those funnels are dragged below the surface, still attached to the ship, their huge tops are pulled below, but they are empty inside, and they create a huge suction. Those who had jumped out of boat 15, and any others unfortunate enough to be close nearby, are pulled under by a maelstrom into the funnel tops and dragged below. 26-year-old Margaret Guire is one of those pulled down. She is dragged below and thinks the end is here. But then, at the last second, a huge pocket of hot air bursts from deep below the ship and blasts her and 2 other passengers nearby to the surface, covered in soot. Lusitania's lifeboats had presented a deadly chaos. Ironically, those who stayed behind at the ship's stern now have the gentlest escape. They simply step off and into the water as it rises around them. The second-class deckhouse tower is engulfed, and then the ship's fantail or her very stern drops. And as it does, Lifeboat 21 on the port side is picked up by the water and breaks free from its lines upside down. Swimming passengers rush to climb on top, and within seconds, Lusitania has disappeared from sight, and the grand old Cunard liner is gone. In her place are hundreds of people struggling in the water, in between bodies and debris. Lusitania had been carrying 22 full-size wooden lifeboats and 48 rafts and collapsible boats of various kinds. But in the end, only 6 lifeboats were successfully launched. And all of these were on the starboard side. On the port side, one boat was successfully lowered, but the plug wasn't installed, so it was swamped. Rita Jolivet is pulled from the water into a lifeboat and she survives, but Charles Frohman doesn't make it. Wireless operator David McCormick survives the sinking. He climbs onto the side of a collapsible lifeboat, and he too is pulled from the water alive later in the afternoon. Staff Captain Anderson had refused to believe that the ship was sinking, but he was wrong, and he was lost in the disaster. However, Captain William Turner stays on the ship's bridge as it sinks from under him, and he is rescued from the water alive. Lusitania sank in just 18 minutes, only 11 miles or 20 kilometers from shore. 1,959 people had been aboard, and there are only 761 survivors. The experience was traumatic and profound for those who had survived. In 1935, Rita Jolivet was giving an interview, and when asked to reflect on Lusitania, she simply said, "How do you imagine it changed me? No, you cannot imagine. And I cannot tell you how much it changed me. There are not words." Gradually, the waters licked up and up the decks, the furnaces belching forth fierce volumes of smoke, as if the great engines were in their last death agony. One by one, the monster funnels melted away as a wax before a flame and crashed upon the decks, till the waters rushed down. Then report after report rang out over the sea, telling of the explosion of the boilers. The waters moved over the deck still, the bows of the ship dipping deeper and deeper into the sea, until the rudders stood straight up from the surface of the water, and poised thus for a few moments, dive perpendicularly into the depths, leaving hardly a ripple behind. Reverend John Fleming. It's November 21st, 1916, and the hospital ship Britannic is mortally wounded. The ship and a complement of medical personnel and crew had been making for Mudros in Greece, with orders to pick up the war's wounded and bring them home to Southampton. 1,066 souls were on board in all, 350 members of the Royal Army Medical Corps, 673 crew, 70 nurses, including a young Violet Jessup who'd survived the Titanic disaster just 4 years before, 17 young Sea Scouts who volunteered to help with the tasks around the ship, and the vessel's captain, Alfred Bartlett. It was a clear sunny day. The sea was calm, shimmering and placid. Those aboard were spending the morning calmly eating breakfast, preparing to take on soldiers, ensuring all 3,000 beds were made up and supply checklists were complete. Dead ahead, unbeknownst to them all, a German moored contact mine was laying in wait, having just been laid by the submarine U-73 the day before. It was packed with wet gun cotton, armed with 150 kilograms or 330 pounds worth of explosive charge, and needed only the slightest impact with the ship's hull to trigger a devastating explosion. On this particular morning, Violet Jessup, a stewardess who'd survived the Titanic disaster, was in the ship's pantry near the dining saloon, readying breakfast for a fellow nurse who'd fallen ill. She recalled the mood among the doctors and the nurses in the dining saloon. Friendly banter filled the air, and the atmosphere was lively and jovial. A teapot in one hand, a plate of butter in the other, she turned to make her way back toward her sick companion's bed, when suddenly the peaceful chatter was replaced by the sound of a sudden, deafening roar. The ship seemed to quake stem to stern, as though in response to pain. Britannic had been hit, though no one knew yet exactly by what. One of the first areas aboard the ship to bear the brunt of the damage from the mine was the barracks rooms on the lower decks near the ship's forepeak, where many members of the Royal Army Medical Corps were housed. In his barrack, on G-deck, Private John Cuthbertson found himself knocked off his feet by a sudden surge of water rushing in from the hole blasted in the ship's side. When he was finally able to orient himself, he found he'd been deposited onto what remained of a staircase on E-deck, a full 2 decks higher. Even closer to the impact site was stoker Bert Smith, who found himself disoriented and covered in coal dust, groping his way around stoke hold 11 before finding himself pinned against a boiler by the sudden deluge. Grasping for anything that would give him purchase, he managed to pull himself along until he found his way to a nearby emergency staircase that led up to the boat deck before he could be swept away entirely by the inrush. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, there had been little in the way of panic on the higher decks, but a sense of confusion reigned. Many of the ship's nurses and crew noticed little more than a loud bang, followed by a shudder when the ship collided with the mine that sealed her fate. In the dining area, where many of the nurses were breakfasting, the shattering of china as it hit the floor could be heard, whether it was crockery falling from tables or a teacup slipping from the hands of a startled nurse. At this point, few on board knew exactly what had just happened, and most of the passengers were shocked and confused rather than panicked. Major Harold Priestley of the Royal Army Medical Corps called for calm among the nurses in the dining room, assuring them that until the alarm sounded there was no need to evacuate, and the room settled into a precarious, kind of uneasy quiet. For Violet Jessup, the unnatural calm before the storm was as noticeable as it was unnerving. Having experienced the horror and chaos of Titanic's sinking, she couldn't help but note the vivid contrast to the scene playing out before her. While Titanic had eventually sunk amidst a flurry of drama and panic, the doctors, nurses, and crew members surrounding her had all been trained for this precise situation. Titanic had been a peacetime tragedy, but now, in what was arguably the bloodiest year of the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, there had been a quiet preparedness, if not expectation, of disaster. Then, within moments of the initial shudder, the emergency alarm began to sound, shattering any fleeting notion that crisis had been averted. The dining saloon emptied in a flash. Nurses, who had been calmly enjoying their breakfast just moments before, sprang into action at once, tracking down life jackets, rounding up the few bare essentials they could carry with them, and making for the boat deck with all the practiced efficiency their training had granted them. As it became clearer that all was not well, the theories of a collision with a barge turned to whispers of a torpedo attack from a nearby U-boat. Archie Jewell, a lookout who, like Jessup, had also survived the sinking of Titanic and was now part of the Britannic's crew, was near the site of impact when the explosion had struck. He described the ship shaking, followed by a massive inrush of water and the smell of powder. It was the unmistakable calling card of a naval mine. He would be among the first to realise the true nature of the emergency, though even after the ship was gone, many continued to believe she'd been dealt her fatal blow at the hands of a German U-boat firing a torpedo. 15-year-old George Perman, one of the Sea Scouts helping with tasks around the ship, had been attending to one of the vessel's lifts. After the collision occurred, many instinctively began to prepare to evacuate. George, though, remained behind, dutifully operating the lift he was assigned to, until a Britannic began to list too heavily to continue. When the order to head to the lifeboats was given, he finally abandoned his post and made for the lifeboat station. Another 15-year-old scout, Henry Pope, recalled feeling the ship shudder as he was eating his breakfast. After realizing there had been an impact of some kind, he headed to the purser's station where he'd been assigned, telling Purser Claude Lancaster in a chipper tone, "It's been a big explosion, sir, but I don't think it will do us much harm." Up on the bridge, decisions needed to be made, and fast. Just 10 minutes after the mine had torn a hole in the side of the ship, Britannic had flooded as much as her sister Titanic had in 1 hour. In Titanic's case, flooding had been quickened thanks to the watertight bulkheads not extending any higher than E-deck. In Britannic's case, her inner skin, which had been installed after Titanic's sinking and the lessons that had been learnt from it, only extended as far forward as Boiler Room 6. And while she could have stayed afloat with the first 6 of her compartments flooded, the explosion had destroyed the bulkhead between holds 2 and 3, and the bulkhead between compartments 1 and 2 hadn't fared much better. This, along with the damage inflicted on a watertight door that caused it to jam open in its tracks, allowed a torrent of water to flood throughout the ship's compartments. The Mediterranean was now flowing into Britannic unabated, and within just 2 minutes of the initial explosion, the first 2 cavernous boiler rooms were completely flooded. From his assessment of the damage, Captain Bartlett was hopeful that the ship would ultimately survive, but he realised an evacuation would need to get underway as soon as possible. He ordered the engines stopped, and the watertight doors closed, the lifeboats uncovered and readied. What he didn't realise was that watertight door that refused to close, allowing water to pour in freely. Throughout the ship, 4 long blasts of a whistle could be heard, signifying to everybody aboard that they should all proceed to their lifeboat stations. An SOS went out via the ship's wireless, but no response came. Another message was sent out, then another. Still, there was no reply. The Marconi operators wondered if the apparatus had been damaged in the sinking. If so, the only rescue they could hope for would be from a nearby ship, happening to spot them while passing through the channel. But who knew how long that would take? All the officers and crew could do now was hold their breath and wait. On the bridge, moments after calling for the evacuation, Captain Bartlett was desperate for a saving grace. He spied, some 3 miles distant on the horizon, the island of Kia, igniting the tiniest spark of hope. It hadn't taken long to realise the ship's steering gear had been damaged in the explosion, but with the propellers still functioning, Bartlett reckoned he could use them to steer his ship toward land with hopes of beaching his vessel. The island was tantalisingly close. If Britannic could only stay afloat long enough to make it there, perhaps his ship and its entire complement could be saved. His mind made up, he ordered the engines restarted and the course set for the island, calling to him off in the distance. He ordered the evacuation be paused while he made his gamble, and then he prayed. At the same time, the ship's nurses and medical staff were busy rounding up their valuables, donning their life jackets and making for the boat deck. After helping a fellow nurse to evacuate, Violet Jessup recalled making sure to grab her toothbrush, a luxury she regretted having to do without after having finally been rescued on Carpathia after the sinking of Titanic. As she made for the boat deck with her toothbrush tucked into her apron, she realised that in her rush she had made a costly mistake, the same one she had warned many passengers against in her years spent as a stewardess. By placing her life jacket on over her coat, she would have to struggle to cast off the extra weight if she found herself underwater. She could only hope it wouldn't come to that. "I did not bother to change," she wrote, as I felt reassured that this time there would be room in the lifeboats for all, and I did not expect to be in the water. As the ship once again ploughed ahead, her forward momentum through the water caused the flooding to worsen down below. Now, with her bow dipping lower and lower in the water, Britannic was inching closer to death. Without Bartlett realising it, what he had hoped would be a saving grace was now putting his ship and all on board in a more precarious situation. Meanwhile, as the doctors, the nurses and the orderlies assembled at their lifeboat stations, there was little in the way of panic or confusion. There were no gunshots or shouts of women and children only, as there had been on Titanic. One Royal Army Medical Corps member later told the press, "I know that women can be brave, but I never dreamed they could rise to such heights of cool, unflinching courage as those nurses did when, under Miss Dowse, the matron, they lined up on deck like so many soldiers and unconcernedly and calmly waited their turn to enter the boats. We men are proud of them, and we can only hope England will hear of their courage. They were magnificent." Officers began calmly loading nurses into their lifeboats, but until the ship's engines were once again stopped, the boats couldn't be safely launched. Nurse Sheila Macbeth Mitchell later recalled, "We were kept hanging over the side for a long time. We did not realise that while we were hanging over the side of the ship, the whole forepart of her was under the water. We might have been more frightened if we had seen it." It was a scene that seemed to exist in sharp contrast to the chaotic evacuation on Titanic just a few years prior. Reverend John Fleming later wrote that the word was soon passed from the boats to draft the men forward in 50s. We took them up thus from the promenade to the boat deck, and when each 50 was counted out, the rest, being ordered to wait, not a man endeavoured to rush, but all quietly awaited their turn. Soon all the men were to their stations and off on the boats. But it wasn't without its difficulties. Britannic had taken on a list so severe, the forward port side davits were now unusable, and no lifeboats could be launched from them. Time was running out to evacuate those still on board. Further aft, at the stern, 2 lifeboats were loaded to capacity and launched into the sea by firemen. The captain's orders to halt the evacuation hadn't reached them, nor were the men meant to be in charge of the lifeboats to begin with. Violet Jessup just happened to arrive on the deck in time to find a place in the next lifeboat set to be loaded. It was lowered away, and with the list increasing by the second, lowering the boats down the ship's side and launching them into the water was proving to be a difficult task. The wooden clinker-built boat scraped its way down the steel sides of the ship, the lifeboat falls catching on the frame of an open porthole, and the popping green lanterns that had once lit the ship up as a hospital vessel at night time showered the occupants with broken glass. Some, in the lifeboats already in the water, were now clinging to the falls from which their lifeboats had once hung, terrified. It was a strange sight, in contrast to the orderliness of the rest of the evacuation. The two lifeboats that had just been launched ahead of Violet's boat were now in an all-new struggle of their own, fighting against suction that seemed to pull them back in toward the ship. Trying to make sense of the scene, Violet spotted red streaks and pieces of wreckage dotting the water. Then, in a moment of horrific realization, her eyes fell on the culprit. The ship's shining bronze propellers, churning away in an attempt to drive the vessel towards shore, were now rising towards the water's surface, pulling lifeboats in with their powerful suction. The horrifying reality set in. People were escaping a sinking ship only to be immediately faced with a far more gruesome end. Nurse matron Elizabeth Ann Dowse described the horrific scene when she said, "I saw that boat with its poor, pathetic crew get dragged into the churning propellers. I suppose I was shaken to the core, but I could not show this. If I dared reveal fear, it would spread like a brush fire on the veldt. I sat there, emotionless, for what emotion could I have expressed, if not fear and sorrow?" While hands pushed and shoved against the ship's side, trying to get the lifeboat away, Jessup turned to see young George Perman, the 15-year-old Sea Scout who'd been operating one of the ship's lifts until the final possible moment, clinging to the falls of their own lifeboat, his eyes filled with terror. "I'm not really afraid," he told her. "I'm only doing this to keep the boat steady." On the bridge, Captain Bartlett was still holding out a glimmer of hope for his Hail Mary, pushing the ship at full steam with the horizon seemingly just barely out of reach. He had no idea that on the other end of his ship, the situation was devolving into an all-out bloodbath. Within seconds of the lifeboat having finally hit the water, Violet Jessup quickly found herself alone, save for one doctor. All the others had jumped overboard to escape the gruesome fate that awaited them. It was at this moment that, despite her brush with death at sea just a few years prior, she realised she couldn't actually swim. It was in large part due to having lost a portion of her lung thanks to a childhood illness. The idea of drowning paralysed her, nearly pinned her to the spot where she sat. But with the spinning bronze screws now drawing ever closer to the water's surface and the tiny wooden boat she was in being pulled in closer to them as well with every passing second, she knew it was now or never. With one last gulp of air, she pushed all fear to the furthest corners of her mind and jumped into the water. Captain Bartlett realised his attempts at saving his ship were in vain. Her bow had dipped even deeper into the water, almost in protest, and reports quickly came in that the flooding had now extended all the way up to D-deck. It became clear that he was fighting a losing battle. It was over. Knowing he had done all that he could, he sounded the final alarm to abandon ship. With the forward boiler rooms now completely underwater and the island of Kia still out of reach, it was time to call it quits. Just before the ship's 38-ton propellers could reduce the lifeboat to matchsticks, the engine stopped and the blades slowed to a lazy halt. Unbeknownst to Bartlett, Violet Jessup and many others were fighting for their lives in the water. The ship was now completely stopped, but the ordeal, for many of those who had jumped from their lifeboats, was not yet over. Violet recalled the disorienting feeling of being underwater for the first time in her life, grasping for anything within reach, flailing helplessly to find a way to the surface. She found herself weighed down by her coat, her life jacket stubbornly holding it in place. As she fought for the surface, her head slammed against something hard and unforgiving. Once, then twice, then nearly a third time. It was the bottom of a lifeboat, and the impact had been violent enough to crack her skull. Desperate and disoriented, Violet groped in all directions for anything to hold onto, only to finally feel the fingers of a hand stretched out to meet hers. Suddenly, she later said, "Joy of joys. I touched something, an arm, that moved as mine moved. My fingers gripped it like a vice, but only for a second, until my almost senseless head remembered what is said of the people drowning, that they retain their hold after death, bringing death to another. With that cheering thought, I let go. Finally, she managed to surface, grabbing hold of a life jacket floating nearby, and tasted air once again. She wanted to be grateful to be alive, but upon opening her eyes, the scenes of death and carnage playing out all around her would be enough to haunt her the rest of her life. She later wrote, all around were heartbreaking scenes of agony, poor limbs wrenched out as if some giant had torn them in his rage. The dead floated by so peacefully now, men coming up only to go down again for the last time, a look of frightful horror on their faces. With the engines now stopped, Captain Bartlett gave the order to First Officer Oliver to take charge of one of the ship's motor launchers to pick up those in the water who had either jumped overboard or narrowly escaped as the propellers smashed their lifeboats to pieces. As the ship began to list more heavily and sink down farther and farther by the head, the launching of the lifeboats became more and more difficult until, eventually, every davit on the ship was useless. 35 of the ship's 48 boats were now in the water, and the rest would go down with her. There was little left to do for those still on board other than to throw any deck chairs, life preservers and furniture they could get their hands on to shipmates in the water and then get away in whatever way they could. Reverend John Fleming described watching the scene play out from his place on a lifeboat. We could see, he later said, the waves splashing already well over the bows and playing with them, as waves play with the sand dreadnoughts of the children on the beach. Suddenly, the last alarm pealed shrill over the glistening waters, warning all who were still nobly at work below to come on deck. And a little later, the final, solitary, haunting note tolled forth, telling all to forsake the ship. Bartlett remained on the bridge, delivering orders through a megaphone, until the water lapped at his feet. He had held out as long as he could, and it was time to let Britannic go. As was custom, Captain Bartlett thought he would be the final one to leave his ship. He stepped from the starboard bridge wing and into the Aegean Sea, swam to a nearby collapsible boat, and then he bore witness to the final plunge of his ship. But Bartlett was not the last man to leave Britannic. A party of engineers came up the ladders from deep below in the vessel's bowels. They'd remained at their posts to the last, and they too jumped away from the sinking liner around the same time, or just after, Bartlett did. With that, the massive steel giant was abandoned completely, and physics took over. Among those also looking on as Britannic went under was 15-year-old Henry Pope, another one of the Sea Scouts who'd been working under Purser Lancaster. He described the sinking with a sense of detached coolness that betrayed his years. I was sorry, he said, to see the big ship sink in the bright sunshine, with her starboard side almost on the bottom of the ocean. As the sea swirled into her big funnels, they broke off, one after another with the heavy strain, as if wrenched from the steel plates on the hurricane deck. Her bow hit the bottom of the shallow-channeled waters, while her stern rose some 150 feet into the air, as though the ship herself was making one last attempt to defy her end. But her fate was sealed. After a few brief moments, with a sorrowful groan, she rolled over, almost pathetically onto her starboard side, resigning herself to the depths. One by one, her once proud smokestacks peeled themselves off the decks and crashed into the sea below. The sounds of explosions from the boilers came bellowing forth from the lifeless hulk of Britannic as the sea finally swallowed her whole, with the sunlight kissing her goodbye for the last time at 9:07 a.m. A sense of the desert overwhelmed my soul, wrote John Fleming. Not long before, one could see nothing but the Britannic. The very hills on the adjacent island seemed small. Now, all that was left of Britain's greatest ship was a score of crowded boats, and a little aimless wreckage on the wave. It took more than 2 long years to build. It represented some 2 million sterling, and it took only 50 minutes for it to go down. HMHS Britannic was gone. All that was left of the great hospital ship was a confetti of wreckage and a handful of filled boats, swimmers awaiting rescue, and floating human remains. But, for a mercy, help was close at hand. Mere moments after the ship had breathed her last, a small flotilla of Greek fishing boats were on the scene to fish survivors from the water and lend what aid they could. Not long after that, the destroyers, HMS Scourge and HMS Heroic, could be seen on the horizon, sparing the survivors the grueling hours of torment that had been endured by those from Titanic. But how had they known to come if the ship's wireless apparatus had been damaged? It was later found that the damage to her wireless only caused failure on the receiving end. Her distress calls had been heard, loud and clear. And in another stroke of good luck, the Heroic had just passed by Britannic 1 hour earlier while leaving the Kier Channel and turned around to render aid immediately, with Scourge and French tugs Goliath and Polyphemus, plus a nearby trawler, all following close behind. When Britannic foundered, it was far from the nightmare the victims of Titanic had experienced. While Titanic sank during a cold April night with little shipping traffic in the area, Britannic, by contrast, sank on a warm, sunny day, where survivors could quickly be spotted and fished from the waters by nearby ships. Reverend John Fleming later wrote of an officer on board whose young son fervently prayed for the safety of his father and all those aboard the ship, and mused that the prayers of this young boy had prevented the worst from coming to pass. He himself had admitted to taking up the prayer of the man's son, saying that he had prayed that if the ship had to go down, it might be in daylight when the sea was calm and when land was not far away. There may be, he said, some who contend that this was mere coincidence, but many of us who were in the way of trial there felt that God was honouring the simple faith of a little child and teaching us vividly that more things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of. But the sinking was not without its horrors, the brutality of war being among the most evident. Among the victims were 9 members of the ship's medical personnel, non-combatant forces tasked with aiding the war's wounded. Despite the ship's paint scheme granting them immunity from attack, fate had dealt them a cruel hand that no white hull and red cross could ever spare them from. The largest hospital ship of the Allied war effort was now resting 400 feet beneath the surface of the Aegean Sea, and would ultimately be recognised as the largest ship of any kind sunk during World War I. Mercifully, the quick thinking and the excellent training of the ship's complement of nurses, doctors and crew members resulted in the saving of all but 30 lives during the sinking. And while it had been a valiant effort, Bartlett's attempt to beach his ship and the subsequent breakdown of communication during the evacuation efforts had been responsible for all of the fatalities that occurred. Had the evacuation been halted, as was ordered, or had the captain simply decided against the attempt to beach his ship, all 1,066 souls aboard Britannic would have been saved. HMHS Britannic had been planned to go to sea with all the elegance and luxury of her 2 sister ships. Instead, she would never see a day as the palatial liner she was intended to be. A wartime tragedy with none of the Edwardian drama of her older sister, the Britannic's sinking failed to capture public attention the way Titanic had. Instead, when Britannic was lost, it scarcely managed to make headlines, save for a piece on the front page of the New York Times, reframing the sinking as anti-German propaganda by erroneously painting the disaster as the work of 2 U-boats and calling the sinking the latest reminder of German barbarity, whose wickedness topped even the sinking of the Lusitania. This spark of outrage failed to ignite, and the loss of Britannic would go on to be little more than a footnote in the history of the First World War.